60 fathoms beneath the cold, dark waters of the Baltic Sea lies a tomb. No headstone marks this grave. No flowers are laid upon it. Here in the depths off Nerva Island rest the bodies of 42 young men who died in the space of 11 minutes on a freezing November night in 1944. Their names are recorded in dusty archives in Berlin and Moscow. But the sea keeps its secrets, and history has largely forgotten their sacrifice. This is the story of the Battle of Nerva Island, a vicious, close-quarters engagement between German and Soviet torpedo boats that exemplified the brutal maritime war fought in the Baltic during the final year of World War II. It is a story of courage and desperation, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, of men who fought in conditions so extreme that nature itself seemed determined to kill them even before the enemy could. The Baltic Sea in late 1944 was not merely a battlefield. It was an environment so hostile, so unforgiving, that survival required superhuman endurance even in peacetime. Add to this the constant threat of enemy action, the knowledge that one mistake could send you to the bottom in minutes, and the crushing psychological weight of a losing war, and you begin to understand what these men endured. November 14, 1944. The temperature hovers just below freezing. A bitter wind cuts across the gray waters like a knife. Somewhere in the darkness, men are preparing to kill each other. This is their story. To understand the Battle of Nerva Island, we must first understand the Baltic Sea itself. This enclosed body of water that had become one of the most contested and dangerous theaters of the entire Second World War. By late 1944, the Baltic was a killing ground, a frozen hell where thousands of sailors had already perished, and thousands more would die before the war's end. The strategic situation was desperate for Nazi Germany. Soviet forces had launched their massive summer offensive, Operation Bagration, which had shattered German Army Group Center and driven deep into Poland and the Baltic states. By autumn, Soviet armies stood on the borders of East Prussia itself, and Army Group North, more than 200,000 German soldiers, found itself trapped in the Courland Peninsula, cut off from the Reich by land. The Baltic Sea became their only lifeline. Every day, German vessels fought to keep the sea lanes open, evacuating wounded soldiers, bringing in ammunition and supplies, carrying out the thousands of daily missions that kept an isolated army alive. Control of these waters was not merely tactically important. It was existential. Lose the Baltic and Army Group North would be forced to surrender. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would march into Soviet captivity, and most would never return. Standing in their way was the Soviet Baltic Fleet, battered but unbowed after 3 years of brutal warfare. Soviet submarines prowled the depths, their aircraft hunted German convoys, and their torpedo boats, fast and deadly, struck from the darkness, like wolves attacking a wounded bear. The torpedo boat war in the Baltic was unlike anything else in World War II. These were not the massive battleship engagements of the Pacific or the Atlantic convoy battles. This was intimate, brutal combat, small vessels fighting at point-blank range in near-total darkness, where victory went to the side with better nerves, faster reflexes, and just a little more luck. The German vessels that would fight at Nerva Island were Schnellboote, fast attack craft that the Allies called E-boats. These were magnificent machines, the products of German naval engineering at its finest. 95 feet long, displacing 100 tons, powered by 3 supercharged Daimler-Benz diesel engines that could push them to speeds exceeding 40 knots. They were armed with 2 torpedo tubes and multiple cannon, 20mm guns that could fire 600 rounds per minute, shredding enemy vessels at close range. But for all their engineering excellence, these boats had one critical weakness: they were built of wood. The designers had chosen wooden hulls to save weight and improve speed. It was a brilliant decision from an engineering standpoint. From a survival standpoint, it was terrifying. A direct hit from even a small caliber shell could start a fire that would consume the entire vessel in minutes. The crews knew this. They lived with this knowledge every time they went to sea. The Soviet G5 class torpedo boats were smaller, just 60 feet long, but they were fast and maneuverable, capable of 42 knots in calm seas. They carried 2 torpedoes and machine guns. Like their German counterparts, they were built for speed and hitting power, not for taking punishment. In a torpedo boat engagement, the first vessel to score a hit usually won. There were no second chances. The men who crewed these vessels were a special breed. They had to be. Torpedo boat duty required a unique combination of technical skill, physical courage, and the ability to function under extreme stress. These were not 18-year-old conscripts. These were professionals, experienced sailors who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in either navy. They knew the odds. They went anyway. The German flotilla that would fight at Nerva Island was commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Friedrich Weber, a 28-year-old officer who had already become something of a legend in the small, tight-knit community of S-boat commanders. Weber had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1936, drawn to the Navy by a love of the sea that had been with him since childhood. He had trained on surface ships, served on destroyers, and finally found his calling with the Schnellboot in 1942. By late 1944, Weber had survived more than 40 combat missions in the Baltic. He had fought Soviet destroyers, tangled with patrol boats, laid mines in enemy harbors, and rescued downed Luftwaffe pilots from freezing waters. He had been recommended for the Knight's Cross twice, though the decoration had not yet been approved. His crews trusted him absolutely, the greatest compliment one sailor can give another. Weber was not a Nazi ideologue. His letters home, preserved in German naval archives, reveal a man who fought not for Hitler or the party, but for his crew, and for Germany itself. He knew the war was lost. By November 1944, every rational German officer knew it, but Weber believed in duty, in protecting his men, in completing the mission. These beliefs would be tested to their limit at Nerva Island. On the evening of November 13th, Weber received his orders. Intelligence had detected increased Soviet torpedo boat activity near Nerva Island, a small rocky outcrop in the Gulf of Finland. Soviet vessels were using the island as a base for attacks on German convoys. Weber was ordered to take 3 S-boats, intercept the Soviet forces, and destroy them. It was a mission he had carried out dozens of times before, but this time would be different. Weber gathered his commanders in the operations room at the German base at Libau, modern-day Liepāja, Latvia. The base was a grim place in November 1944. Everyone knew the Soviets were coming. It was only a matter of time. But for now the base functioned, the boats went out, and the missions continued. Weber spread a chart of the Gulf of Finland across the table. His finger traced a route northeast from Libau, past the Latvian coast toward the open waters where Nerva Island sat like a sentinel. The island itself was nothing, just rocks and stunted trees, uninhabited and unimportant except for its location. But its location made it crucial. Vessels using Nerva Island as a waypoint could intercept German convoys moving between Tallinn and the Courland Peninsula. The plan was straightforward, perhaps too straightforward. Weber's flotilla would depart at 2100 hours, proceed northeast at economical speed to conserve fuel, and arrive in the Nerva Island area around 2300 hours. They would then conduct a sweep of the waters north of the island, hoping to catch Soviet vessels silhouetted against the slightly lighter eastern horizon. If they made contact, they would engage immediately, using their speed and firepower to overwhelm the enemy before the Soviets could react. But Weber was uneasy. The intelligence was too specific, too detailed. How did German intelligence know exactly where the Soviet boats would be? Had the information been deliberately leaked? Was this a trap? Weber voiced his concerns to his commanders. They had no answers. The mission would proceed as planned. The 3 vessels selected for the mission were S-59, Weber's command boat, S-63, commanded by Oberleutnant Hans Kramer, a quiet, competent officer from Hamburg, and S-71, under the command of Lieutenant Klaus Richter, the youngest commander in the flotilla at just 24 years old. Between them, the 3 boats carried crews totaling 93 men. By dawn, more than 30 of them would be dead. At 2100 hours precisely, the 3 S-boats slipped their moorings and headed out of Libau harbor. The evening was clear and bitterly cold. Ice was already forming on the harbor walls. The deck crews worked quickly, their breath frosting in the frigid air, ensuring that all equipment was secure, all weapons ready. Every man knew that in these temperatures, a fall into the water meant death in minutes. There would be no rescue, no second chances. As the boats cleared the harbor breakwater and entered open water, the seas began to build. The Baltic in November is never calm, and tonight was no exception. 2-meter swells rolled in from the northwest, causing the wooden hulls to flex and groan. Spray broke over the bows, instantly freezing on contact with the metal fittings. Crew members moved carefully, knowing that one slip on the icy deck could send them overboard. The voyage northeast would take nearly 2 hours. Weber ordered economical speed, 20 knots, to conserve fuel and reduce engine noise as they approached the target area. The 3 boats moved in a loose line-ahead formation, maintaining visual contact but staying far enough apart that a single Soviet torpedo couldn't take out multiple vessels. For the crew, these hours before battle were the worst. There was nothing to do but wait and think and try to stay warm. The heating systems in S-boats were minimal at best. Men huddled in whatever shelter they could find, smoking cigarettes, checking and rechecking their weapons, telling familiar jokes to distract themselves from what was coming. Some prayed, others stared into the darkness, lost in their own thoughts. Weber stood on the bridge of S-59, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon. He had fought this battle before, not this specific engagement, but dozens like it. He knew what was coming. The sudden flash of torpedo launch, the hammering of machine guns, the screams of wounded men, the flames. Always the flames, consuming wooden hulls with terrifying speed. He had seen friends die. He had pulled burned men from the water. And yet here he was, going back into it again, because this was his duty and these were his men. At 22:30 hours, the flotilla altered course to the east, approaching the Nerva Island area. Weber ordered all boats to battle stations. Throughout the 3 vessels, men moved to their positions. Torpedo crews prepared their weapons, removing the safety pins, flooding the tubes. Gunners traversed their weapons, ensuring smooth movement. Engineers monitored the temperamental engines, ready to coax every ounce of speed from them when the time came. The waiting was almost over. At 22:37 hours, the lookout on S-59 spotted movement. 800 meters to the northeast, barely visible in the darkness, a darker shape was moving slowly across the water. Weber raised his binoculars. Yes, there. A vessel. Probably a patrol boat proceeding southeast at what looked like 12 knots. Was it alone? Were there others nearby? Weber had to decide. Engage immediately or wait for more information. The decision was made for him. From S-71, the trailing boat in the formation, came an urgent radio call. Richter, the young commander, had spotted additional contacts to the north. Multiple vessels moving at high speed, converging on the German flotilla's position. This was no chance encounter. The Soviets had known they were coming. This was an ambush. Weber's mind raced through the tactical situation in seconds. He was caught between 2 Soviet forces, the patrol boat to the northeast and the fast-moving contacts to the north. If he turned to engage the patrol boat, the northern force would have a perfect torpedo angle on his stern. If he turned north to face the threat there, the patrol boat could attack from behind. There was no good option. There was only the least bad option. Weber made his decision. He ordered the flotilla to turn hard to starboard, bringing all 3 boats onto an easterly heading. This would present their bows to the northern threat, minimizing their silhouette and allowing them to bring their forward guns to bear. They would deal with the patrol boat later. Right now, the immediate threat was to the north. The 3 S-boats heeled into the turn, their engines roaring as they accelerated to attack speed. 35 knots, 40 knots. The wooden hulls shuddered with the strain. Spray exploded over the bows, drenching the forward gun crews who crouched behind their thin shields and waited for targets to appear. They didn't have to wait long. At 22:39 hours, the Soviet torpedo boats revealed themselves. 4 G5-class vessels emerging from behind Nerva Island, where they had been lying in wait. Engines screaming as they accelerated to intercept the German flotilla. Range, 1,500 meters and closing fast. Weber experienced a moment of perfect clarity, the kind of preternatural awareness that sometimes comes in combat. He could see the entire tactical situation laid out before him like pieces on a chessboard. The Soviets had superior numbers and had chosen the battlefield. But his boats were faster, his crews were better trained, and he had the initiative. If he could close the range quickly, get inside the Soviet torpedo envelope, he could turn this ambush into a gun battle. And in a gun battle, the side with better shooting won. What happened next would later be described by survivors as the cauldron, a swirling, Chaotic melee fought at murderously close range in near total darkness. The neat tactical plans dissolved in seconds as the two forces collided. At 22:40 hours, both sides launched torpedoes almost simultaneously. The German boats fired at the nearest Soviet vessels. The Soviets returned fire, sending their own torpedoes racing toward the German line. The water between the opposing forces became a deadly crosshatch of torpedo tracks, invisible in the darkness but present in every commander's mind as they threw their vessels into violent, evasive maneuvers. S-59. Weber's boat turned hard to port, engines screaming, as a Soviet torpedo passed down her starboard side with less than 10 meters to spare. The torpedo's wake was clearly visible in the darkness, a phosphorescent line that marked the boundary between life and death. 1 degree different in Weber's turn. 1 second's hesitation and S-59 would have been cut in half. But Weber had no time to contemplate his narrow escape. Soviet 12.7-meter machine gun fire was raking his vessel, the tracers looking like orange lines being drawn across the darkness. His forward gunner returned fire, the 20-millimeter cannon hammering out short, controlled bursts. The range was down to 400 meters now, close enough to see the enemy vessels clearly, close enough to see men moving on their decks, close enough to kill. Behind Weber, S-63 and S-71 were engaged in their own desperate battles. Kramer, commanding S-63, had turned southeast pursuing a Soviet boat that had just launched torpedoes and was now trying to escape. His gunners poured fire into the Soviet vessel, walking their tracers along its hull. The Soviet boat was hit, slowing, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But it wasn't finished. Its rear gun was still firing, and the rounds were finding their mark. S-63 took hits in the bridge area. Men were down, but Kramer kept coming, closing the range, determined to finish the enemy vessel. S-71, the trailing boat, found itself in the worst position. Richter had been forced to make a radical turn to avoid a torpedo, and the maneuver had left his vessel isolated from the rest of the flotilla, surrounded by 3 Soviet boats that were closing in like wolves around a wounded deer. Richter fought brilliantly, using his superior speed to stay ahead of his pursuers, his gunners engaging multiple targets simultaneously. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and everyone aboard S-71 knew it was only a matter of time. At 22:41 hours, the battle reached its climax. 3 separate engagements were happening simultaneously within a square kilometer of ocean, and in the space of 30 seconds, everything changed. A Soviet torpedo, whether aimed at S-63 or simply fired on a bearing and left to find whatever target fate provided, struck Kramer's boat just aft of amidships. The explosion was catastrophic. The wooden hull, stressed by years of hard use, simply disintegrated. The fuel tanks ruptured, igniting instantly. In less than 10 seconds, S-63 had become a floating inferno. In less than 60 seconds, she had disappeared beneath the waves. Of her crew of 33 men, only 2, thrown clear by the explosion, survived to be pulled from the water by Soviet boats. They would spend the rest of the war in Soviet prison camps. The other 31 were gone, their deaths so quick that many probably never knew what had killed them. But the Soviets paid a price too. Weber, witnessing the destruction of Kramer's boat, felt a cold rage descend upon him. He turned S-59 toward the nearest Soviet vessel and closed to point-blank range, less than 300 meters. At that range, he couldn't miss. He launched a single torpedo, watched it race across the dark water, and saw it strike the Soviet G5 just forward of the bridge. The explosion lifted the small vessel's bow clear of the water. When it came down, the boat broke in 2. It sank in less than 90 seconds, taking its entire crew of 11 men with it. There were no survivors. By 22:45 hours, both sides had suffered grievous losses, and both commanders, Weber for the Germans, Captain Lieutenant Alexei Marinesko for the Soviets, faced the same calculation. Press the attack and risk losing more vessels, or break contact and preserve what remained of their forces? Weber's situation was becoming untenable. He had lost S-63 with almost all hands. 71 was damaged and taking on water. S-59, his own boat, had been hit several times by machine gun fire and was showing signs of engine trouble. He was deep in Soviet-controlled waters, far from any support, fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger even as his own forces weakened. The young Richter, commanding the damaged S-71, radioed Weber. His voice was calm despite the desperate situation. He reported that his starboard engine was out, His port engine was losing power and he had casualties among his crew. He could make perhaps 20 knots, maybe less. In a running battle with Soviet torpedo boats that could make 42 knots, he was a sitting duck. Weber faced the hardest decision of his life. Standard naval doctrine was clear. In a situation like this, the damaged vessel should be abandoned and scuttled to prevent capture. The crew would be taken aboard the surviving boats and S-71 would be sent to the bottom. It was the logical, tactically sound decision, but Weber couldn't do it. These weren't abstract tactical pieces on a map. These were his men, sailors he had trained with, fought beside, drunk with in the officers' mess. The thought of abandoning them even to save them was unbearable. He would get them all home, or they would all die together. Weber ordered S-59 and S-71 to turn west and make best speed for Libau. S-59 would stay with the damaged boat, providing covering fire if the Soviets pursued. It was a decision that violated every principle of naval warfare he had been taught. It risked both surviving boats to save one damaged vessel. It was tactically indefensible. It was also the right thing to do. On the Soviet side, Captain Lieutenant Marinesco faced his own agonizing calculation. He had lost one boat with all hands. Another was damaged and limping back toward base. He had the Germans on the run, but pursuing them would take his remaining boats into open water, away from the protective shelter of Nerva Island, into an area where German reinforcements might appear at any moment. Marinesco was no fool. He knew that the Germans never operated alone. Where there were 3 S-boats, there might be 6 more just over the horizon. And while his crews were brave and skilled, they had been fighting for 3 years. They were tired. The boats were tired. Equipment that should have been replaced months ago was being held together by improvisation and prayer. The Soviet commander made his decision. He would not pursue. He had bloodied the German flotilla, sunk one of their boats, and driven them away from Nerva Island. In Soviet naval doctrine, this counted as a victory. His superiors in Leningrad would be satisfied. More importantly, most of his men would live to see another day. Marinesco ordered his boats to break off the engagement and return to base. The Battle of Nerva Island was over. The guns fell silent. The darkness, which had been shattered by tracers and explosions and the screams of dying men, closed in once more. And the Baltic Sea, indifferent to human suffering, continued its eternal rhythm of wave and wind. The voyage back to Libau was a nightmare. S-71's damaged engines repeatedly threatened to quit entirely. Her crew worked frantically in the engine room, where the temperature exceeded 40 degrees Celsius despite the freezing conditions outside, trying to keep the wounded machinery running. Above decks, the medical orderly tended to the wounded, men with shrapnel wounds, burns, broken bones from being thrown against bulkheads during the violent maneuvering. Weber stood on the bridge of S-59, watching S-71 struggle through the darkness behind him. Every few minutes, S-71's engines would falter, her speed would drop, and Weber's heart would stop until the engines caught again and the damaged boat lurched forward. They were still 60 kilometers from Libau, 60 kilometers through hostile waters, expecting at any moment to see Soviet torpedo boats emerging from the darkness to finish what they had started. But the attack never came. Perhaps the Soviets had had enough. Perhaps they never knew how vulnerable the German boats were. Perhaps it was simply luck, that arbitrary factor that determines who lives and who dies in war. Whatever the reason, no further Soviet vessels appeared. At Euro 1:20 hours on November 15th, the 2 surviving S-boats entered Libau harbor. Crews on the base dock stood in silence as S-71 limped in, her hull scarred by machine gun fire, her deck stained with blood. Medical teams rushed forward to evacuate the wounded. Senior officers appeared, demanding reports, wanting to know what had happened, why one boat had been lost. Weber climbed stiffly down from S-59's bridge. He had been on his feet for more than 6 hours, most of that time in combat. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, but there would be no rest yet. There were reports to write, letters to compose to the families of the dead, recommendations for decorations for men who had shown extraordinary courage. The administrative aftermath of battle is as exhausting as the battle itself. Young Richter approached Weber on the dock. The 2 officers looked at each other for a long moment. No words were necessary. Richter knew that Weber had violated standing orders to stay with S-71. He knew that Weber had risked his own boat and his own life to save Richter's crew. There was no adequate way to express gratitude for such an act. Richter simply saluted and Weber returned it, and that was enough. In the days following the Battle of Nerva Island, the full cost of the engagement became clear. S-63 had been lost with 31 dead. S-71 had suffered 3 dead and 8 wounded. S-59 had 4 wounded. Total German casualties 34 dead, 12 wounded. For a single engagement lasting less than 15 minutes, these were staggering losses. Soviet casualties were similarly heavy. The G5 that Weber had torpedoed had taken all 11 of its crew to the bottom. The damaged Soviet boat that had made it back to base had lost 3 men killed and 5 wounded in the action. Total Soviet casualties: 14 dead, 5 wounded, 48 men dead in 11 minutes of combat. 48 sons, husbands, brothers, fathers gone in the time it takes to eat lunch. This was the mathematics of the torpedo boat war in the Baltic. This was the price of controlling these frozen, contested waters. The official reports told a story of tactical decisions and weapons performance and navigational details. But they couldn't capture what the survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of friends dying, the screams of burning men, the knowledge that they had survived largely through luck, that any of them could just as easily have been among the dead. Weber was eventually awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions at Nerva Island, specifically for his decision to stay with the damaged S-71 rather than abandon her. The citation praised his extraordinary courage and devotion to his men in the face of overwhelming odds. Weber accepted the decoration with mixed feelings. Yes, he had saved Richter and his crew, but 31 men from S-63 were still dead, and no amount of medals could change that. On the Soviet side, Marinesco was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for successfully defending the Nerva Island approaches and sinking a German S-boat. The official Soviet account of the battle described it as a decisive victory over fascist naval forces, which was the kind of propaganda language common to all sides in World War II. In reality, both sides knew it had been a brutal, costly draw. The Battle of Nerva Island was never famous. It rated perhaps 2 paragraphs in the official German naval history and a brief mention in Soviet naval records. No documentaries were made about it. No memorials were erected. The 48 men who died that night became footnotes in the vast ledger of World War II's casualties, individual tragedies lost in the overwhelming scale of the conflict. But for those who fought there, for those who survived, Nerva Island was everything. It was the place where they discovered what they were truly made of, where they learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, where they saw their friends die and somehow found the strength to keep fighting. Friedrich Weber survived the war. He returned to Germany, married, had children, and worked as a maritime engineer until his retirement. He rarely spoke of his wartime service. When his grandchildren asked about the Knight's Cross that hung in a frame in his study, he would smile sadly and say only, "I did what any good officer would have done." He died in 1987, taking most of his memories of that terrible night to the grave. Alexei Marinesco also survived, continuing to serve in the Soviet Navy until 1945. He received multiple decorations for his service in the Baltic. After the war, he worked in a shipyard and lived quietly until his death in 1979. Like Weber, he rarely discussed his wartime experiences in detail. Today, the Baltic Sea has forgotten the Battle of Nerva Island. Cargo ships and passenger ferries pass over the spot where S-63 and the Soviet G5 went down, unaware of the drama that unfolded in these waters more than 80 years ago. The wrecks lie undisturbed on the seafloor, slowly being consumed by the sea, becoming part of the geology rather than the history of this place. But we should remember the courage of men on both sides who fought in impossible conditions for causes larger than themselves. We should remember the price they paid. 48 lives snuffed out in 11 minutes of fury and fire. We should remember that war, even in its smallest engagements, even in forgotten corners of forgotten theaters, demands everything from those who fight it. The Battle of Nerva Island reminds us that history is not made only by presidents and generals, but by young men standing on the decks of wooden boats, facing death in the darkness, doing their duty as they understood it. They deserve to be remembered. This is their story. May they rest in peace beneath the waves.